Hello everyone, I am your Heap, and this is the Great American Novel Series brought to you by the Author's Matrix. And tonight's show, we'll be looking at Chapter 12 of The Village Idiot. As you may recall, in Chapter 11, our hero, Nigel Crumbly, met the real hero, Addison Way, up in the highlands, and was quite perplexed with this person. Is this person insane? Water? Clear water? That made no sense to him. Well, let's see what happens in Chapter 12 of The Village Idiot. Take it away.
Chapter 12. The morning came, and Nigel awoke, realizing he was still alive. He felt no fatigue from the previous day, and was surprised that he thought lying in bed was normal. Thankfully, there were no ill effects from the water that he had unwittingly consumed, unbeknownst to him, at the behest of that man in the highlands. The first thing, since I am still alive, is to cleanse my body from that water forced upon me by that lunatic, Nigel thought. Quickly dressing, he raced past his parents sitting at the kitchen table and made his way across the street to the open sewage trench and scooped up a cupful of raw sewage and poured it down his ready throat, gagging on the fecal matter as he managed to swallow it all. Not satisfied that merely one cup was enough to restore his being, he scooped a second cup and downed that with alacrity. As he felt restored, he immediately vomited the better part of the sewage water back into the trench, smiled at his restoration, and returned to the house to join his parents at the breakfast table. "You had quite a day yesterday, Nigel," Jonah said to his son as he plopped down in his chair beside them. "We never saw you the whole day." "I went up to the highlands, father, to study nature," Nigel reported, as his mum set a steaming bowl of porridge before him, simmered with the very raw sewage water taken from the trench where he had just purged himself from the non-existent effects of the water fed to him by the miracle man in the highlands. As Nigel dug into the bowl of porridge, he paused momentarily and asked his parents, "Do you know of anyone who isn't ill?" "My, Nigel, that is a most strange question for your father and myself," Edith said as she dipped her spoon in her bowl of rancid porridge. "Whatever makes you ask such a question as that?" "Well," Nigel began. "Who's ill?" Jonah asked. "I don't know anybody who is ill. Do you, Edith?" Edith was gagging on a chunk of fecal matter when the question was posed, so she could not answer but acknowledged her husband's inquiry instead. "I mean, father," Nigel continued, "is it possible that someone could grow old and still be without any ailments?" Jonah laughed and put down his spoon. "Son, if you look around you, we are all healthy, your mum and I, and we are old." He bellowed a hearty laugh. Edith laughed too, as her choking on the fecal matter had ended, and she could swallow it whole. Although Nigel felt the miracle man he met in the highlands was indeed a lunatic, he could not get out of his mind the robust health that man seemed to enjoy. He had never seen anyone in his life at that advanced age, or for that matter, any age that seemed so healthy and free of disease. As he slowly ate his porridge, Nigel mused that perhaps what had happened to him in the highlands did not happen to him. He remembered sitting by the stream feeling faint. Was it possible that the whole encounter with that man was merely a nightmare? Nigel looked at both of his parents' sores and watched as they ran to the bathroom multiple times to vomit while eating their porridge cooked in raw sewage, and thought of his father's words only a moment ago. Are these signs of good health? Nigel wondered to himself. Then he patted the top of his head, where he had been nursing an open sore for weeks, constantly treating it with sewage from the trench. "What is troubling you, son?" Edith asked after returning from the bathroom moments ago. "You seem lost now." Nigel didn't realize how much he had drifted away in these thoughts until his mum's questions roused him back to the breakfast table. "Do you know anyone who does not have open sores on their bodies?" Nigel asked. "What a strange question, Nigel," his father exclaimed. "Why wouldn't a person have open sores?" Before he waited for Nigel's response, his father clutched his throat and ran off to the bathroom to vomit. When he returned, he asked again, "Where are these questions coming from, Nigel?" "Well, Father," Nigel began cautiously, "what if a person reached old age, but their body looked fresh and free from open sores, and that person had boundless energy? Would you find that strange?" Jonah and Edith looked at each other, hoping the other one would address a nonsensical question as Nigel had just proposed. His father smiled. "Nigel, that person does not exist. You are talking fantasy now. It is God's will that we all age, become ill and die. Why would you think to question that?" "These sores we all carry," Nigel responded. "Are they signs of ill health?" "Look, son," Jonah continued, "everyone has these open sores somewhere on their bodies. Why would they not?" "What causes them, Father?" Nigel asked. "Why, son?" Edith responded. "It is all part of God's will. It is natural." Nigel was a young adult, but he felt his parents were talking to him as if he was still a young boy. He was a university man studying biology, and he deserved better answers than the ones he received from his parents. "I need to get to class, Mum," Nigel said as he scooped up the remaining porridge in his bowl, leaving his parents confused. "Do you think the university is putting such foolish ideas in his head?" Edith asked her husband as he gagged once more on a large chunk of fecal matter stuck in his throat. Nigel arrived early for his morning class and found himself in his anatomy class, surrounded by his classmates. As he surveyed the room, he saw a group of young adults, all covered with sores, faces gaunt, and some leaving the room to vomit. "Is this God's will?" Nigel said to himself. It was the first time in his life that he questioned the nature of his existence and others. "We are all the same here," Nigel thought to himself. The professor strode into the room, and Nigel noticed the sore on his forehead had spread violently since the last class. The gait of the professor as he entered the room, despite his attempt at confidence, showed a man near death. He said nothing as he sat at his massive oak desk and prepared his notes for today's lecture. When his papers had been adequately shuffled, the professor looked up. Nigel wasted no time raising his hand to ask a preemptive question. "Professor Umph, I have a question, sir." The professor looked upon Nigel as if bothered by the interruption and scrunched his scrawny nose, adjusted his reading glasses, and put his hand on top of his head to check the ooze coming from a rather large sore that had opened overnight. "What is it, Crumbly?" "We are all immersed in the study of the human body, Professor," Nigel began, slightly nervous. "But I was curious about how medical science explains the state of our health. All of us here in this classroom have open sores, some more than others, all over our bodies. Is this natural?" Professor Umph grunted and readjusted his glasses once more. "That is a foolish question, Crumbly. I don't know why you would ask such a question in my anatomy class. Is living free of sores, constant vomiting, and overall fatigue possible?" Nigel was testing Professor Umph's patience with his questions, and the professor would have not of it. "The state of mankind is the state of mankind, Crumbly," the professor began, clearly irritated now. "It is not ours to question the ways of nature." The rest of the class giggled under their collective breaths and turned to look at Nigel, who was now embarrassed. It was the first time he thought to question humanity's health, individually and collectively. What now struck him, however, was that no one had ever thought to raise these questions before. He thought back to the miracle man he met in the highlands yesterday, whom he thought was a lunatic. He could not recall the man's name, but the sight of him, so robust and energetic at his advanced age, stuck with him, and he could not rid the image from his mind, no matter how he tried. He felt Professor Umph was mocking his questions, and he was correct. Nigel failed to venture any more questions at this time. His embarrassment was complete. Walking home that afternoon after classes, He pondered why he had felt embarrassed asking such a question. It seemed a logical question to ask a science professor at a university who was supposedly teaching his students about the human body. Did it not? Why did the professor blithely dismiss his question as if it had no validity? These were questions that Nigel had no answer to, but he was determined to find out. As he reached his home, he found his mum stooping over the open trench across the street, scooping up a bucket full of raw sewage to prepare for the evening meal, or so he surmised. Being a doting son, he travelled across the street to help his mum with her bucket. As he proceeded to fill the bucket to the rim, his mum smiled at him and said, "You seem distracted today, Nigel." Nigel could not disguise his inner torment from being humiliated by his professor in front of his peers that afternoon, and it showed. A mum's instinct is often decisive in these situations, and Edith's was no exception. She had an innate way of knowing when her only remaining son was distressed. After Nigel had successfully transported the bucket of sewage water into the house and set it beside the stove, Edith asked him to join her at the kitchen table for a bit. "What is it, Nigel?" she inquired. "It is a mere nothing, Mum," Nigel lied. "Now, Nigel," Edith continued, "a mum knows. It is best to tell me outright. I don't like guessing." Edith was firm, and Nigel felt he had no choice but to speak honestly to her. "It was Professor Umph, Mum. I asked a question in class today, and he was rude and dismissive." Edith sat back. "What in the world did you ask to provoke him?" "I didn't provoke him, Mum," Nigel responded with a touch of resentment in his voice. Edith realised her error and swiftly revised her question. "What did you ask, Nigel, that upset him so?" The question was kinder and less accusatory, and Nigel relaxed. "I simply asked the professor how medical science explains the state of mankind's health." Edith looked quizzically at him. "That is it? Why would you ask such a question in a science class?" Nigel looked up, aghast at his mum. Her response to his question was not unlike the professor's. "Mum!" Nigel nearly shouted. "Blimey! It is an anatomy class! We study the human body in all its complexities. Why wouldn't a student ask such a question?" Edith looked at her son and appeared honestly confused. "Mum," Nigel continued, "look all around you. Everyone we know, everyone we pass in the street is covered with open sores. People have chunks of hair falling out all the time. We all vomit a dozen times a day. Does anyone you know not to appear fatigued all the time? Everyone we know dies young. Does all this seem natural to you?" Nigel raised his voice, and his mum would have none of it. "Of course, it seems natural to me, Nigel. Why would it seem unnatural? It is God's will." Nigel never imagined he would ever be having such a conversation with anyone like this in his life, but now he was in the midst of such a discussion. Secretly, his mum was annoyed that he had brought up that same subject to his professor and had opened up with her and Jonah that morning. "Nigel, son," Edith continued, "go ask any doctor. This is our natural life. I feel wonderful." Nigel sat there and stared at his gaunt, nearly emaciated mum with a massive sore oozing some kind of foreign substance that filled the room with its stench, and she was telling him she felt wonderful. Edith smiled the grim smile of someone near death, pretending all was well. "Just don't ask such questions in class, Nigel," his mum continued, "and all will be well." As Edith uttered those utterly ridiculous words, Nigel's father arrived, having left work early. Jonah Crumbly dragged himself into their receiving room, summarily slumped into the couch, and closed his eyes. The exhaustion was writ large all over his face as he wheezed slowly. "Your father is home now, Nigel," Edith said. "Let him rest now, and we can continue this conversation when he awakes. I am sure he will offer the same advice as I have just given you." Leaving Nigel in a state of confusion and disbelief, Edith abruptly rose from the table and made her way to the stove, where she plopped a large chunk of raw sewage into the pot on the stove in preparation for the porridge she was about to cook for their evening meal. The meal went on without incident. There was no discussion of the day's events, and Nigel was determined to avoid it at all costs. There was too much to make sense of now, and he did not wish to get into an argument with his parents. He realized the results would be the same if he brought it up again. He dutifully consumed his porridge in silence as he watched his parents more closely than ever. They both looked ill to him. He questioned himself why he did not see the extent of their decline before. They both sat there, smiling at each other as they ate, and Nigel felt he was looking at two corpses sitting astride him at the dining table, and he shook. The following morning, Nigel decided to skip his university classes for the day and head back into the highlands in search of the miracle man. In his mind, the back and forths were terrible as he made the trek up the back hills. On the one hand, he thought the man was a lunatic. However, if his recollection was correct, this seemingly elderly man enjoyed vibrant health like no one else Nigel had ever encountered in his short life. But what of the glass filled with nothing? Nigel asked himself as the climb began to weary him. The lunatic said the glass he showed me was filled with water, yet there was no brown colour to it. In fact, there was no colour at all, he puzzled. The dichotomy disturbed Nigel greatly, and he was determined to resolve it today. Maybe, he reasoned, what he witnessed as vibrant health was nothing of the sort. Perhaps the miracle man somehow hid his sores from himself. Nigel had questions but no answers. The more he tried to discern the meaning of this elderly man in the highlands, the more confused he became. The climb up the highlands wearied him more than he had expected, and he needed rest. He found a shaded area and took a nap. When he awoke, the sun was now warm and at its zenith in the sky. It cannot be much further, he decided, as he recognized various landmarks he had committed to memory not long before he came upon the lone cabin where the miracle man resided. Nigel determined that he would not be cowed by this old man and marched to the cabin door and began rapping aggressively. It was only a brief moment, but the door swung open, and before he stood the miracle man or lunatic, who greeted him with a hearty, "Hello, Nigel. It is so good to see you again." Nigel had twisted his last encounter with this man so much in his mind that he was taken aback by the friendliness and sincerity of Addison's greeting. This left Nigel tongue-tied for a brief moment. "Won't you come in, Nigel?" Addison asked. After briefly hesitating, he accepted Addison's invitation and entered the cabin. The one-room cabin was as he remembered. Although he was recovering from exhaustion and dehydration the last time he visited this abode, he felt fine today, and the cabin appeared the same as before. He concluded that he had not been delusional the last time he was here. Everything was the same. Addison pulled up a chair at his small dining table and offered Nigel to sit, which he did. "What brings you up here again, Nigel?" he asked. Nigel had half expected to expose this lunatic as such, but was greeted by such a kindly elderly man that his initial purpose vanished. "Why did I come?" Nigel asked himself. On the one hand, he was convinced that this man was a lunatic. Still, he was perplexed after the reception he received from his professor at the university the other day, devoid of any intellectual curiosity. He questioned his perception of the elderly man sitting before him. "Well, sir," Nigel began haltingly, "I came to see how you were getting along." That was not the reason, but Nigel felt it was close enough to an honest answer that he would give it rather than have his mind go blank. "How very kind of you, Nigel," Addison chirped. "I am doing quite well, thank you for asking." Nigel had never met an individual so friendly. Why was this man so joyous living up here alone in the highlands? He asked. Nigel sat for a moment, not knowing what to say. He had half expected to find an old, abandoned cabin in the highlands, with no discernible evidence that anyone had occupied its environs in decades. That would have sufficed his intellectual curiosity, and he could have logically concluded that he had never met this miracle man or lunatic up here, and the question would have been resolved. However, this miracle man was sitting across from him, as natural as possible, and Nigel was more confused than ever. "Did you offer me water the last time I was here, sir? I was out of it and cannot recall our first meeting." "Yes, indeed, Nigel," Addison replied. "Would you care for some more now? You look a little parched after your trek up into the highlands." Nigel felt this was the only way to confirm his vague memories of his last visit, so he accepted Addison's offer. He observed as Addison walked across the cabin to the tiny kitchen area and reached for a large pitcher set aside. Nigel observed that the pitcher was made of clay, so he could not ascertain its contents. Addison poured a glass for Nigel, similar to the one he had used the other day, and the result was the same. The clear glass seemed empty even as it was nearly full of water. It was all not a hallucination, Nigel thought as Addison set the glass before him. "Here you go, Nigel," Addison said as he sat down. The last time Nigel was in this position, with a glass of crystal-clear liquid in front of him that Addison had claimed was actually water, he was nearly delusional. Today, however, Nigel was clear-thinking and had his wits about him. He told himself he was born to be a scientist, and now was his opportunity to prove it. "What is this, sir?" Nigel inquired as he spun the glass around and around in a semicircle. "Why, this is a glass of water, Nigel," Addison replied. "No brown colour, sir?" Nigel asked. "Of course not, Nigel," Addison replied with a smile. "It is pure water. There is no raw sewage within the glass." Nigel studied the glass before him yet again, but with steadier eyes than the other day. He was clear thinking now, and not in the fog brought on by exhaustion as before. The glass was indeed full of a substance that the elderly man defined as water. How could this be? Wondered Nigel to himself. He was not delusional as he suspected he might have been the previous day. The glass was filled with a liquid with no colour, smell, or chunks of fecal matter. It was true. "Why, sir?" Nigel began. "Please, Nigel," Addison said, interrupting him. "Call me Addison. Let us not use the years between us to force an arbitrary formality." "Addison, then." Nigel smiled, welcoming the elderly man's friendliness. "Why is there nothing in this glass save a clear, colourless, odourless liquid? It does not make any sense to me." Addison took up the glass and held it to the light. "This is what water is when all the toxins are removed." "Toxins?" Nigel yelped. "What do you mean by toxins, Addison?" "The seeming water that humanity consumes daily is water contaminated by raw sewage. Mankind was never supposed to consume it. It is poisonous to our system. It is against our very lives to welcome it into our bodies." Nigel reflected on the words of the wise gentleman sitting across from him. "The water you are looking at now in this glass is simply water, and nothing more or less. I have removed all the impurities, so that only pure, crystal-clear water remains." Addison continued. Nigel took up the glass set before him and peered deeply into it, and could find nothing. It was as Addison had just remarked, and as clear as the air surrounding him. He could see the bottom of the glass without artificially straining his eyes. It was like he was looking through nothing at all. Nigel sniffed the contents of the glass and smelled nothing. The substance within the glass was pure without any colour or odour, yet Addison contended that it was still water. How can it be that all of us drink water so-called contaminated with raw sewage if it is so injurious to our health? This was the question of the ages. It was the question that Addison had wrestled with his entire life, ever since he was a university student, making the discoveries about the nature of water on his own. "If you dare, Nigel, try taking a sip of the water and see for yourself," Addison asked. Nigel remembered that he had taken some of Addison's water the other day, but that was under duress and against his knowledge. Now, were he to take a sip of it, that would be done of his own free will. He hesitated. Addison knew the hesitation and could read it on Nigel's face. "The water in that glass, Nigel," Addison reassured Nigel, "is as pure as can be. It will not harm you, but rather, it will strengthen you considerably." The sheer confidence with which Addison spoke assured Nigel. It was an arrogant confidence that he had witnessed in other people, like his professors at the university. As he held the glass and prepared himself to take a sip, he thought back to his brief conversation with Professor Umph the other day, and how he dismissed his question as if it was beneath him to answer. On the other hand, Addison shows none of the professor's condescending arrogance. Addison did not push Nigel to drink the water. He waited patiently until Nigel had made up his mind. "But what if this so-called water, as you call it, is poisonous to my system?" Nigel asked. "Nigel," Addison began, "you have been drinking putrid raw sewage all of your life. Is that not correct?" "Yes, sir," Nigel replied softly. "And everyone you have ever known in your life has done the same as you?" Addison queried. Nigel put the glass on the table and looked off to the side. "That is true, sir." "And what of their health, Nigel?" Addison asked gently. "My mum says she and my father are just fine," Nigel replied. "We had a discussion this morning at breakfast. When I brought up the subject of their health, they both assured me they felt wonderful. They insisted it was God's will that we all eventually get sick and die, and there is no reason to question that fact." "And when your mum said she felt wonderful, what did you think to yourself?" Addison asked. Now, Nigel hesitated once again. He thought of the sight of his parents sitting at that kitchen table, both covered with oozing sores, gaunt, and his father exhausted. "My professor said the same thing to me in class yesterday. Professor Umph insisted that questioning the health of mankind was foolish, and I shan't waste my education with such foolishness." Addison sat back with a pained look on his face. He thought back to the day many decades ago when he met with Dean Bugg and was expelled from the university. The dean said the most horrible things to him that morning, accusing him of scientific heresy. That vicious article in the Crumbly Village Times destroyed his academic career that morning. Addison knew of the terrific snobbery present in members of the press, and he learned it that fateful day. He left that same university where Nigel was now studying, feeling his life was forever cursed. "It is important, Nigel," Addison began once he composed himself, "that you use your critical mind to ascertain what is true in this world." Nigel smiled at Addison and stared again at the crystal-clear water in the glass before him, but could not bring himself to take even the smallest sip. "Why do you contend that raw sewage water is poisonous?" Addison put the glass aside and asked Nigel to follow him. The two left the cabin, and Addison led Nigel further up the highlands, stopping at the stream where Nigel had first observed him swimming by himself. "I recognize this river," Nigel said. "I passed by it during one of my adventures in the highlands." "This is where I like to swim, Nigel," Addison said. "The water is so pure in this natural setting." Addison reached into the stream, cupped a small amount of water in his hand, and showed it to Nigel. "Do you see, Nigel, how pure this water is?" "Yes, it seems pure, but I would never drink it," Nigel said emphatically. Addison chuckled. "I am not asking you to drink it, Nigel. This water is not pure in the strictest scientific sense. There are thousands of microscopic impurities present in this water. However, compared to the filth that mankind consumes daily, this water is far superior for consumption." Addison asked Nigel to hold out his hand, and he poured a bit of water into it. It was chilly. "And you swim in this water?" he asked. "Oh yes," Addison replied. "It is quite refreshing. It is a scientific fact that clear water does wonders for the human body." "Out of curiosity, Addison," Nigel asked as he emptied his hand of the water, "if you find this highland stream refreshing, what do you use to bathe in on a daily basis? Surely you don't take your morning bath here in the stream." Addison chuckled again. "Of course not, Nigel. I bathe in the same water I drink and cook with. Nothing but pure, uncontaminated water, like in the glass I offered you back in my cabin." Nigel looked at him quizzically. "You take your bath in nothing. My family always takes our baths in the sewage water we retrieve from the trench outside our house." Addison smiled. "Nigel, humanity has always cleansed themselves in toxic, putrid, raw sewage water, just as they have used it for drinking and cooking. Just because something has gone on for as long as anyone can remember does not mean the practice is healthy or beneficial to the human self." Nigel said nothing. "Let us return to my cabin. I wish to show you something." Nigel nodded in agreement, and they returned to Addison's cabin. However, they did not enter it. Instead, Addison directed Nigel to follow him behind the cabin, where a large wooden structure stood at least 3 times the size of Addison's cabin. As Addison swung open the large wooden door, Nigel saw what appeared to him a massive laboratory, complete with scientific equipment, and what appeared to be a lecture hall setting off to the side that contained seating for about a dozen students and a lectern at the front, where lectures could be given. "This looks like a university lecture hall in the science department, Addison," Nigel said in amazement as his eyes entered the magnificent room before him. "I have spent my entire adult life building this hall and developing my lab, Nigel," Addison replied with pride. "It has been my life's work." Nigel said nothing more and spent the next few minutes walking about the room, examining the equipment and reading some lecture notes. The area filled with scientific equipment struck Nigel as he had never seen such equipment outside a university classroom. The far wall contained thousands of books on shelves that reached the top of the cathedral ceiling. "This is like a miniature replica of an entire university in your backyard, Addison. I am speechless." Addison smiled and offered him a brief tour, which Nigel readily assented. As Addison explained various aspects of the scientific lab to him, he felt he was back at the university, but without the noticeable condescension typically exhibited by his professors. "Do you hold lectures here, Addison?" Nigel asked as he stared at the rows of seats neatly arranged to the side of the lab. "Oh, yes indeed," replied Addison enthusiastically. "I give lectures once a week on Thursday evenings." "What are the lectures about?" Nigel asked. "Oh, I cover the full range of scientific theory," Addison began. "But my main focus is to educate my students in studying water and its properties." "You lecture all day about something as banal as mere water?" Nigel asked incredulously. He immediately saw the look on Addison's face and swiftly realized he had just insulted his host. "I didn't mean—" Addison cut off Nigel's attempt at an apology and smiled kindly. "Nigel, man's desire to know is among the greatest achievements in evolution. The best thing we can do as humans is to put aside our snobbery and make our desire to know and understand the main thing, whether we are dealing with our parents, literature, art, or especially the field of science." The criticism stung Nigel deeply, but he knew it was deserved. "Now," Addison said, "what do you wish to learn?" That was as large a question that Nigel had ever been asked in his life. No professor at the university had ever taken the time or interest to pose such a question to the young scientist. "Everything," Nigel replied. While it was true, Addison insisted that Nigel be more specific. "Well, Addison, I must admit that I am becoming more intrigued about your study of water. As foolish as I first thought such a study was for a scientist. Here, Nigel had mixed emotions. The notion that humanity had gotten water all wrong these thousands of years seemed to him fanciful. However, when he thought back to his parents' reaction to his questioning of their health, it gave him pause. "Here, Nigel," Addison said. "Let me show you around my lab." Nigel expressed his gratitude, and Addison took him around to the various lab tables, explaining all the scientific instruments and their functions related to his research. At the end of the tour, Addison stopped at a large holding tank, complete with a sophisticated filtration system. "This is where I purify the water that I use for all my needs. As you can see, Nigel, I have a pump that brings in water from a well that I have dug a few meters from my lab. I can pump as much water into my filtration system to satisfy my basic needs and my students' daily needs." "Your students?" Nigel asked. "Oh yes, indeed," Addison replied with pride. "All of my students use my purified water for their daily needs." Nigel was incredulous. "Do you mean to say all your students drink that nothing you showed me moments ago? All of them?" Addison smiled a kindly smile. "Yes, Nigel. Everyone who studies with me drinks fresh, pure water free of all contaminants daily. They also use this water for basic needs, like cooking and bathing. It is quite natural, and all of them enjoy abundant health." This was staggering to Nigel. The realization that more individuals besides Addison drank his water all the time struck him as balmy. "Why do they all drink your water?" "Come, Nigel," Addison replied. "Let me show you some of my basic research on the subject. This knowledge is quite new to you and difficult to comprehend." It took the better part of the following 3 hours, where Addison took on the role of a professor, and Nigel, his student, as he presented much of the beginning evidence he had developed over the past 40 years on the nature of water and its properties. It was a great deal to take in, and Nigel found himself squirming in his seat at times and sitting back agog with wonder that he had never experienced before in a classroom at the university. Addison spoke with such ease about the subject that Nigel began to feel he might be in the presence of greatness. He felt ashamed that he had ever thought of this miracle man as some sort of lunatic. The subject matter was, surprisingly, more complex than Nigel had first imagined, and he found it nearly impossible to follow at times. Addison could see his new student's frustration and would backtrack in his lecture and repeat the material until he was sure Nigel understood. Nigel thought the university professors he had encountered had never taken the time and effort to do what Addison did so naturally. As Addison concluded his lecture, Nigel asked, "May I have some water, Addison?" Addison smiled, walked over to his filtration system, opened the spout, poured a generous amount of clear water into a glass, and handed it to Nigel. While Nigel still hesitated momentarily, despite now being privy to the abundant scientific proof that Addison had spent the better part of the last 3 hours explaining in excruciating detail, he drank the entire contents of the glass willingly. As he put the empty glass down, he tried to taste the water he had just drunk, but there was no taste. "I don't taste a thing," he said, still surprised. "No, Nigel," Addison replied. "There is no taste in pure water. It is merely water, nothing more and nothing less." Nigel stared at the empty glass. "I was just expecting more. I do not feel any different than before I drank your water." "What were you expecting, Nigel?" Addison asked. "Well, I don't know, Addison," Nigel replied. "It's just that you have told me so many magnificent things about the nature of pure water. But when I drank it, I felt nothing. It was like I drank nothing and felt nothing. I admit I am disappointed." Addison sat down next to Nigel and took up the empty glass. "This pure, uncontaminated water is not some magic pill. It is the life-giving substance that sustains our very existence. You should not expect some kind of miracle transformation from drinking merely 1 glass of it. You have been drinking rancid, foul, raw sewage water all your young life. The cumulative effects of such have weakened your entire self, both physically and mentally. It will take more than one glass of pure water to reverse these deleterious effects. Nigel pondered what Addison said, but uttered nothing in reply. He was lost in thought now. After listening to Addison's lecture this afternoon, he had expected so much more and felt his heart sink. What if this elderly man sitting before me is nothing more than a lunatic I thought he was just the other day? Nigel worried that a charlatan had taken him in. Perhaps Addison is just a smooth-talking con man, and that is all, he wondered privately as Addison sat there silent. Addison stood up and retrieved the glass, placing it in the sink at the other end of the room. As he turned about, he saw Nigel standing at the laboratory door, preparing to exit. "I think I should go now, sir," he said quietly. "I skipped my classes this morning at the university, so I have much to catch up on now." "Very well, Nigel," Addison said. He had encountered this reaction all of his adult life. He had found that people reacted enthusiastically when he first explained the properties of water and his discoveries, but then they would retreat. "I am holding a lecture this Thursday evening if you wish to join us. There will be 6 of my students present. You would be most welcome." "Thank you," Nigel replied as he closed the door behind him, sure to avoid eye contact as he left the premises.
So, Nigel finally sits down with his miracle man, Addison Way of the Highlands. He's quite astonished by what he learns, but then he has doubts. It just shows what happens when you're the one who meets new knowledge come into the world that nobody else knows, nobody else believes. Nigel will find out. Well, that wraps up chapter 12. Next week, we'll be looking at chapter 13 of The Village Idiot. Until then, goodbye, good luck, and we'll see you next time. This is Uriah Heep, and this is my Literary Cafe. Good night.